So, how are we feeling? Everyone okay? I get the sense there's a lot of anxiety about this book and discussion of this book. Am I wrong about that? Oh, fuck. I put the stream on normal latency. That's why it's delayed. All right. Your reaction to me will be slower than I would like. Fuck, I can't change that after the stream starts, can I? All right, there's like a 15-second delay. That's okay. This was a controversial book as a book club choice, which I knew. And I will admit to you that when I started book club over a year ago, I actually can't remember when I started this book club. One reason I did is because I wanted something that sort of forced me to read this book. And I had it in my mind that this book would be a book club book. And yeah, selfishly, that was a way of sort of forcing myself to read it. Because this is a really hard book to read. It's deliberately hard to read. It's not just in like a pretentious... One of the points of the book are what David Foster Wallace was trying to do was to... I guess invite you to I don't even know how to get into this. The book is deliberately hard to read because the argument is it's worth reading hard books, and maybe that's good for you and helps expand your mind. So yeah, we started book club last January. Holy shit. So it's taken us a while to get here. This book has been sitting on my shelf for a long time, unread. All right, where do we start? I'll tell you what my sort of preconceptions coming into this, or I think we have to talk a little bit about David Foster Wallace. So I first sort of became aware of David Foster Wallace when I was in university. And I remember I read Jonathan Franzen first, who was a contemporary and friend of Wallace in real life. So I remember reading Freedom when that came out in 2010. Similar to Wallace, Franzen is an author who at the time was sort of heralded as a great American author at a time where there's not a lot of people heralded as great authors, who since the early aughts has become more of a punchline as, you know, overrated white male authors writing in a very white male kind of way. I read a lot of Wallace's nonfiction at the time, and really enjoyed it. And I think the consensus is that Wallace's nonfiction is much easier to read than his fiction. So I had actually not read... I think I'd read a couple of his short stories, but I was mostly familiar with him as a nonfiction writer, an essayist. And I vividly remember one of the best pieces of nonfiction I've ever read and would recommend still is in Consider the Lobster. He basically has a book review of a dictionary. You know what I mean? And that sounds like it should not be interesting in any way. It's called Authority in American Usage, originally published in Harper's, maybe? And it's basically about like this debate between whether dictionaries are, there's a word for this, just these two schools of thoughts about whether we should be prescriptive or descriptive in how language is used. Ben, have you heard, read, or seen This Is Water? Okay, so this is the most accessible way of getting into David Foster Wallace. Is he gave a commencement speech to some students, and that really sort of distills the humanism philosophy underlying a lot of his work. So if you just want to know a little bit about David Foster Wallace and what he was sort of trying to put out into the world, yeah, you should read This Is Water. The thrust of which is if we have a natural tendency to want to believe in things, a sort of religious tendency to want to believe in something. And if you want to live a happy and fulfilling life, which is hard to do, you probably, you should choose to believe something that's bigger than yourself and your own self-gratification. Basically is the thrust of it, and is basically the philosophy underlying Infinite Jest as well, I would argue. To a lot of people, David Foster Wallace is mostly just like a symbol of the tortured artist, like the literary world's Kurt Cobain. He spent time in recovery programs. A lot of Infinite Jest is about recovery, people who are addicted to drugs or alcohol or entertainment. And a lot of it is being written from personal experience. I don't want to get super biographical, because I feel like we could get lost in that. He was a very flawed person too. And yeah, and he committed suicide in his 40s. Infinite Jest was the last full-length fictional book he wrote. An unfinished novel, The Pale King, got released after his death, but I think Infinite Jest is seen as his opus. Most people think of Infinite Jest as that book that is long and complicated, and the book with the end notes. It's about 1,000 pages long. How many pages is it? It is 1,079 pages, and about 200 of those are not footnotes, they're endnotes, which makes it harder to read. And I wonder if there is a bit of a reference to tennis in that you're sort of volleying back and forth between the main text and the footnotes. There's something sort of playful about that. Again, this book is deliberately hard to read. It's an indictment of a culture of fast, easy pop entertainment, and so the book is deliberately a sort of rejection of that. The book is intentionally trying to be the opposite of binge watching Selling Sunset on Netflix. And in the past, 10 years, the novel Infinite Jest came out in 1996, was heralded as a work of genius, which is very rare for any sort of work of fiction, especially anything of that length. And I feel like more recently, in the last 10, 15 years, Infinite Jest and Wallace get sort of grouped into this like hero. He's seen as like a hero of lit bros. So you'll see blog articles and tweets and things that say, you know, yeah, what are the warning signs in a man's bookshelf? They're like a copy of Infinite Jest that looks like it's read. You also see jokes about like a lot of people own this book who will never read it, which is kind of funny. And I was definitely an example of until yesterday. But yeah, and some of this is like in jest or whatever, and sometimes I think it's a little bit more serious, and I think there's a few reasons for this. David Foster Wallace, when he was talking about writing Infinite Jest, one of the thrusts behind it is he's writing from the perspective of him and his life experience and social circumstances, seeing a lot of very affluent kids, well-educated, grew up in stable households who were still like deeply unhappy with their lives. So I think right away there's something a bit at tension with like the current ethos of I think some people, as soon as they hear that, it's kind of like hearing you know, like rich white men can be depressed too kind of vibes. You know what I mean? This is like super reductive, but it's something you might hear like Jordan Peterson say, like, you know, depression among young men is rampant and skyrocketing. And I don't think there's anything wrong with observing it in and of itself, but I feel that is a sort of presupposition you often hear before someone goes on to advocate for some like pretty odious political ideas. And it's certainly not the sort of in vogue. I feel like there's a lot of attention now, and I'm not saying this is a good or bad thing, on, you know, like diversity in authors or yeah, I think there's a bunch of reasons why David Foster Wallace and Jonathan Franzen and sort of authors like this are seen as like just appealing to young white men and wanting to celebrate other types of authors and types of writers. Jordan Peterson keeps coming up in these streams. Yeah, I guess so. I don't know why. I'll say maybe a valid criticism is that I think this is true of Infinite Jest as well. And I feel like this is a very long preamble without really talking about the book, but I feel like it's pretty necessary. There aren't really good female characters in this novel. I mean, there are interesting female characters, but they're mostly serve the purpose of the character development of the male characters. I think that is a very fair criticism of Infinite Jest. And I think it's reasonable to think, and the main reason I think you see a lot of these sort of memes about how like this is a red flag in men is I think a lot of young men who get into literature and want to flex that muscle and want to read the thing that they think other people think is smart or difficult tend to be pretty unpleasant people and probably bad boyfriends. So, yeah, it doesn't shock me that there's a perception that people... I mean, it's a huge overgeneralization, sweeping statement, but like, yeah, you probably met some guy in college who was really into this book who was just like an arrogant asshole. That's probably not a very unique experience. All the females suck, especially the moms? Okay. Yeah, well, okay. Should we just get into what the book is? I guess the book defies in a lot of reviews and things you'll find about this book, people will often say like, oh, you can't really summarize it. I don't think it's that you can't summarize it. It's that summarizing it kind of feels like it goes against the point of the novel, which again is to, in a lot of ways, the novel again is just a rejection of this very fast, superficial entertainment that just fills your time, that you think is making you less lonely, but is probably really making you more lonely. And how reading and writing is a way of feeling less alone, and spending time with a book like this is a way of feeling less alone and feeling more human. And so the idea of just like being on an internet live stream, being like, here's a 5-minute summary of what Infinite Jest is, feels kind of gross in a way. But I can give you a general scope or tell you about some elements of the story and why I think it has some ideas that are worth thinking about. And that is not and can't be a substitute for reading it. And there's also something kind of selfishly a little bit like, for those of us who did read it, how many people in the poll? So there are like 10 people here. 10% of viewers have read the book. 16% did not or could not finish. That's interesting. Or not a surprise. I feel like we owe ourselves a little pat on the back, and just sort of like explaining it to other people feels like it cheapens that a little bit. Do you, the people who read the book, do you sort of agree with me? I'm sad that I wasted so much time reading it. See, that's okay. I want to get into the criticisms. I want to hear people's criticisms. I have trouble understanding. How do I put this? I don't think it's that you have to like the book. I find it very strange. The people who really dislike the book, I can't really relate to that. All right, so the context of the novel, I want to give this sort of like political and social or cultural context of the novel. This is a kind of dystopian near future, super corporatized. Time is subsidized. So like one of the first things you'll see about the book is that the year or calendar is sponsored. So you start in the year of Glad, or the year of the Depend Adult Undergarment, or the year of the Tux Medicated Pad. And that's because the US government was trying to find a way of making up some money. So they started just letting companies sponsor the calendar. And it's funny that the year we start and end in is sponsored by garbage bags. You know, this is a funny book. I know Wallace said he was surprised how funny people found it, because he mostly thought of it as a very sad book, and there is a lot about this book that is very sad. But there's also some it is very funny as well, I think. So the political context is that this is going to sound very like it's reflective of current times, but I promise this is what it's like. Like a former lounge singer entertainer became president of the United States because as a third party candidate, because everyone was just disillusioned and rejected the major Democratic and Republican parties, and just voted for someone who is giving them empty, superficial promises. How do I explain this? There's a lot of toxic waste that makes like the northeastern United States basically uninhabitable. So for political reasons, the United States basically forces Canada to accept their uninhabitable land that they've just been dumping toxic waste on. So we're living in a future where there's ONN, this organization of North American nations. And the sort of political context here is Quebec already wanted to separate from Canada, but now that they are sort of conjoined unwillingly with the much more powerful US, this was done for political reasons also to basically, as much as this story... Sorry, one sec. Why is this going off so much? The closest thing we have to, I guess, to typical bad guys in this book are these Quebec terrorists who want to secede from ONN and Canada. And I don't think they're really framed as bad guys, but they sort of just serve that function if we look at this as like a typical work of fiction. Culturally, this is a world where there are just a lot of people with addiction issues, whether they're addicted to entertainment or addicted to substances. In a lot of ways, this is a book about addiction. And yeah, it's a time where it basically predicted streaming services, but imagine that would be done with people renting individual cartridges. So, this was written at a time where like cable television was like you're basically watching whatever is on TV with commercials. And this describes a future where entertainment became just whatever anyone wanted to watch at any time. Which is, I think, very prescient. And I think that killed the advertising industry, which is why you saw the advertising industry switch to politics, which made these sort of vapid nonsense politicians more electable, which is an interesting connection there. The plot device that sort of animates a lot of the plot, although Infinite Jest is... the plot is very much backdrop to characters. But the plot device here is that there's... a filmmaker invented a film that is so entertaining that if someone watches it, even for a few seconds, they just they lose all will to live or do anything other than watch the film, and they will just watch it until they die. And that might sound like a very cheap metaphor for how people just waste away watching trash television. I promise you it's a little bit more sophisticated than that. But sorry, this is sort of the political and cultural context underlying the novel. These Quebec separatist, terrorist, wheelchair assassins are trying to get the film the entertainment so that they can spread it around the American population, because Americans will be unable to resist the temptation of the entertainment, and then they'll be able to achieve their political goals. That is as much of a summary as I'm going to give you, because the story is more about characters and their experience of depression and addiction. And there is, I mean, this slide before, you can't see this, but this is a character map. And most of the characters are organized within the setting or context of a substance abuse recovery house or a prestigious tennis academy. And the two characters sort of that are most focused on are Hal Incandenza, the son of the filmmaker who also owned or founded this tennis academy, and Don Gately, a former criminal and addict in a recovery program. And again, I guess I've already said this as just sort of like a general idea animating David Foster Wallace's work. But yeah, I think the point of the book, if we want to reduce it to a single sentence, is that we are naturally inclined to believe in something bigger than ourselves, and we aren't satisfied by just the immediate gratification of the kind of American culture of entertainment. And we see that failure in different people. We see how AA, even if you don't believe in a higher power, gives people some sort of way out of this. We see Hal, who is this brilliant tennis prodigy, who I've read some interesting commentary on the book about like how Hal represents. He's a master of language. Like he's memorized the dictionary. He's just like this technically proficient, sort of brilliant person. And despite all of that, he's like a deeply unhappy person. And in a way, I think it serves as like a rejection of postmodernism, which a lot of that presumes that just reality is defined by language. And I think it's deliberate that this guy who has such mastery of language finds like a real emptiness in that proficiency. Ben, did you look into the Hamlet parallels? Okay, so the title of the novel and the title of the entertainment film that makes people die from only wanting to watch it, it's called Infinite Jest. It's a reference to a line in Hamlet where Hamlet discovers the skull of the court jester who entertained him as a child. He says how awful this is. This was a man of infinite jest who gave me so much happiness. There are some parallels to Hamlet. It's been a long time since I read Hamlet. Invaders from the north, the mother having a relationship with her brother. There's a few holding up the skull. Alas, poor Yorick. Yes, that speech. It's a pretty famous excerpt. I'm not sure if I've even told you enough about the plot of Infinite Jest to really get into how it ends, but I will talk about just the structure of the book being that it is told in a non-linear fashion. So a lot of people find the book ends very abruptly. It ends with Don Gately basically reliving his rock bottom in the hospital as a dream or memory. But in a very sort of poetic way, the very first chapter actually takes place after the last chapter in the timeline. So the book sort of begs you to revisit the beginning of the book right after finishing it, sort of like the entertainment itself. And it doesn't give you a definitive conclusion as much as you just, I think, understand the direction the characters are heading in. I know a lot of people are very interested in some hints and clues in the book. There's a point at which Hal's father, the filmmaker, appears to Don Gately in the hospital as a ghost, basically. And I think we are supposed to believe this is true and not purely the hallucination of someone who was shot and refusing painkillers because they're a recovering addict, just having crazy hospital dreams. So there's a lot of people who have spent a lot of time thinking about how that ghost sort of animates the novel. There are hints throughout that there's something a little bit supernatural going on. And there are references to them possibly digging up the dad's grave and finding a lot of the novel is about trying to find the original copy of the entertainment so it can be duplicated and used as a weapon. Yeah, he did haunt the academy for sure. I will say I'm being a little guarded about my thoughts on the story and the conclusion, just because this isn't a book I feel like you should have a super strong opinion about after a first reading. And I very much understand why people dedicate a lot of time to this book, and specifically rereading the book. Oren dug it up much. Yeah, see, like there are a lot of hints that this is what's going on. I generally prefer to. How do I put this? I generally subscribe to the idea that things don't listen outside of the text. So the fact that a lot of that interpretation of the ending depends on you filling in some blanks so entirely doesn't really sit great with me. So it's only to the extent that the novel points us in that direction that I'm okay with that sort of where do these converging lines end up. That's fair. I have no desire at this moment to revisit it. Neither do I. I will not immediately reread this book, but I feel like my feeling is that it will be much more rewarding on a second reading. That's just not something I can or want to do right away. And this is a book you have to want to read. I can't imagine many things more unenjoyable than reading this book against your will. It is a difficult book to read. There are many sections where you are reading incredibly detailed backstories to characters you might only meet once and you never return to. And sometimes that feels senseless and meaningless. And maybe 700 pages later, you might find that there is some connection there that made that feel a little bit more meaningful, and sometimes not. In the very last chapter of the book, we get, there's 20 pages left. You don't really know how it resolves for the two characters I think you feel the most affinity for. And it gives you, like, of the last 20 pages, I think like 10 of them are about a trainer you have never met before. And I don't think it's unreasonable to be incredibly frustrated by that. But I also don't think that is... I think that is very intentional, and the context to that trainer, who is basically, it's about how him and his brother, who was a disillusioned priest, he sort of lost confidence that people had like empathy for their fellow man, so he drops out of the priesthood, and the brother is trying to prove to him that people are still capable of having empathy. So they come up with this experiment where they'll pretend to be homeless, and instead of asking for money, they just want to ask somebody to touch them. I want to feel like some human connection in a most basic way. And what he finds is for weeks, in asking for someone to just touch him on the shoulder, give him a hug, no one will do that. But they'll throw money at him to make themselves feel better, but no one wants to give that sort of human contact to people, until we have the youngest in Cadenza boy, Hal's younger brother, Mario, who is disabled and represents almost this sort of like childlike innocence, comes across these people just wanting any sort of physical interaction with other human beings, and very sort of naively does just hug them. It's a really depressing scene, but like there is like that sort of silver lining there that I think it's one of the more clear examples of that novel just advocating for a very basic return to sincerity and human connection. Mario is older than Hal? I thought Mario was the youngest brother. Mario is a half brother. I think only through a footnote or very brief mention it is intimated he is the son of Avril's later relationship and not of the himself's. Super Mario's in the book yet. I don't think it really matters who the younger brother is. Mario serves as a more naive figure because of his limitations. And they have an older brother who is also sort of like an empty shell of a person who because of his strained relationship with their mother, basically just tries to sleep with married women with families. Is there a song album that you think perfectly references the themes in this book? Perfectly? Certainly not. I was trying to think of a movie. Ben not wanting to admit he's wrong. I'm totally willing to admit I'm wrong. I'm sure there's a lot of things I have wrong about this book. I will say my experience of this book was that the first 100 pages or so was rewarding purely on purely on the level of enjoying the writing. There's a chapter very early on about someone who is just waiting for their drug dealer to show up. And I think it's a really good example of how good a writer Wallace could be. And so I think you could enjoy it purely on that level for the first, like, maybe 100 pages. I found the next 200, 300, 400 pages very difficult to get through because you're being inundated with detail in a really sort of like breathless way. The writing style of Infinite Jest is, you get the impression you're reading something from someone who had too many ideas in their head. That it's like a water hose with too much water coming out of it. And it's difficult to take all of that in. And you don't have a great sense of the context and the characters and how they relate to each other. And then I think a lot of people share this experience of the book that around 400 pages in, there's a couple chapters that make you feel a little bit more grounded in the history and context and where things are in relation to each other. And I feel like everything made more sense after that. I'm specifically thinking there's a long chapter in Endnote about a game they invent on the tennis court called Eschaton. That's basically like a game of Risk played with tennis balls as nuclear weapons. That they play in a way that doesn't seem fun as much as technical. And then a chapter where you find out more about the political context of how North America came together to form one super nation, as told through a finger puppet show, I think it was. It was tempting to troll you and say that I just didn't think it was well written. You wouldn't be the only person who thinks this book is not well written. I think that's a pretty indefensible position myself. I think at the very least, I have trouble relating to someone who can't admire this book purely on a level of just recognizing how ambitious it is. And you could say that it's a work of genius even if you thought a lot of it was gross or bad or unenjoyable, let's say. I was trying to think about why I feel like I have been kind of defensive about people who didn't like the book and maybe a little bit mean to a couple people I saw who were very dismissive of it, I thought. Which isn't really fair of me. You're allowed to not like it. But I do think it, because it is promoting this idea of sincerity and a condemnation of like a very cynical, sarcastic, ironic style of living that just feels very empty and safe, and it's easy to not get hurt if you just like don't really believe in anything and aren't willing to make yourself feel vulnerable. So when a book is really sort of advancing what feels like a very sincere and vulnerable message of humanism, and people are like really dismissive of that, it does feel like you're taking someone being very nakedly vulnerable and just kind of shitting on them. And I feel like that's why I have sort of a visceral reaction to people who are quick to criticize the book. And I feel like a lot of the criticism comes from people who have not even really read the book. I know that's not totally fair, but I don't know how you give this book a good faith reading and come out of it being so dismissive of it. And it's not to say books like this are... I feel like there are debates, and this is noted in the foreword, which I only read after the book. But it sort of talks about how there's lots of, I guess, tension between this idea that fiction should just be like pure entertainment and accessible, and the idea that fiction should be challenging and difficult and open the horizons of your mind. And the truth is, for most readers, they don't see things in that sort of tension. They'll read books they enjoy, and sometimes those are stimulating, and sometimes you just want to be entertained. Not sure where I was going with that. But I will say, like, Infinite Jest definitely falls into the camp of being a book that's hard to read, that's supposed to make you think. And if you want to just read books that are about escapism and are just enjoyable on more of a level of, I want to read about a creative story, you know, like if you just want to read like Harry Potter. This is going to sound insulting. I'm not trying to make it that way. It's okay if you want to read novels or books that are more enjoyable as forms of escapism or entertainment in that sort of way. But that's not what this book is, and what it wants you to think is something that fiction can uniquely do, I think. The animal violence was a huge turnoff for me. There's a lot of really objectionable stuff in this movie. Yeah, there is a really despicable character in the recovery house who tortures stray animals to feel some sense of control in life. And there's numerous people with either first or second hand experience of child sexual abuse in the novel, and some of this is described in like really graphic, awful detail, and sometimes described in a way that feels kind of flippant, and sometimes that feels like it makes sense because it's being told from the perspective of a certain kind of person that you might meet in a alcohol abuse program, who is not being sensitive to language, or who is casually racist. So yeah, I can understand if purely because of that content, it's not enjoyable. There's nothing enjoyable about those sections. Like, they're not supposed to be fun or funny. I don't think it's that black and white. I want to read challenging books, but I tend to have been burned by male white authors with their blatant racism, sexism. Hard to trust them. Yeah, did you feel like... Like there are definitely elements of racism and sexism and misogyny in this book. Did you at any time feel like it was normalizing or justifying? Like, is it just objectionable that it's in there and it's not only in there to be condemned? Because I guess, yeah, I only have a certain perspective on this that I can't really relate to it the same way other people can, right? Again, I don't think the purpose of the book was to make some to try to make some anti. It's not a book about social justice, and it's willing to show you very flawed, ugly people who embody bigotry. Horror and comedy need to punch up, not down. The horror is effective when it's used to condemn abusers. Yeah, like there's a lot of characters with disabilities in this book, and sometimes it's kind of played for laughs. Like the Quebec separatist terrorists are all in wheelchairs because they played a game as children where they saw who would be the last to get off the railroad tracks, like a game of chicken. And yeah, there were points in the book that were kind of humorous in that you have these very threatening, nefarious people sort of wheeling around in squeaky wheelchairs. Like there is something very absurd about that. But like in that regard, though, I never felt like it was done at the expense of disabled people. Like I don't think it was that sort of kicking down. See, a lot of this will sound insane if you haven't read it. There's a lot of absurd humor in the book. That's the sort of thing I cannot stand. Yeah, okay, I get that. And I will say I do generally understand the perspective that this book appeals more to men than women. And I feel like at least a few of you are women. I didn't find any of it humorous. Oh, come on. When they're talking about like the lounge singer who became the president, at one point lounge singers were involved in a work stoppage. So they would perform shows in Vegas where they would do the crowd work, but then when they went to sing the songs, they just wouldn't make any noise. That's funny, right? I don't know why that example sticks out to me so much, but I thought that was like a really just like throwaway line. But that one has really stuck with me. Come on. Don't you have like 75% women viewers? We could ask right now. How many people are here? Book club might be a different sort of sample. It's like 100 people here. What about the toenail clipping phone call? I love all the phone calls between Hal and Oren. Yeah, those were a lot of fun. Those were fun. This book wasn't all just like incredibly depressing. I thought women couldn't read. That's offensive. So for people who didn't like the book, Can you give me a reason other than you didn't like the objectionable content, like of references to animal abuse or racism? I think you sold me on the book. Gonna read it. Good luck. If anyone here hasn't read the book and is now thinking about reading it, I think it is worth it. I don't know what advice I have for you. There are a lot of people who've created guides now to help read the book. I would be kind to yourself while reading it. I'm here to watch a man mansplain a book for men that makes me feel bad. What a way to spend a Sunday. That's pretty funny. Does it feel like I'm mansplaining to you? I'm trying to tell you what I think about the book as one of the few people here who has read it. So yes, I am explaining the book to you. I happen to be a man. That makes me feel... Did it really make you feel bad? Because really what I hope the book does, and you don't have to read the book to explore this idea. Like, I encourage you to go read his commencement address. Or other nonfiction work from Wallace is better or easier to get into than this book or any of his fiction. But this idea of how we're all being sort of numbed by the cynicism and sort of superficial nature of a lot of modern entertainment. There are ideas in this book worth exploring, whether you enjoyed the book or not. And I really reject people who are so dismissive of the book that I feel like they aren't willing to even sort of see that sort of underlying value. Yeah, so Tamrissa Tea Lady, who has been very vocal about how much she hated this book, I hear you, and again, it feels like you're just listing the objectionable topics or content there. Like, is that the reason you hated the book? Did you find nothing sort of redeeming or valuable in it? Or was it that these things were so objectionable to you, you weren't even interested in seeing around them? If there was something around them to see. When you say it's a challenging read, do you just mean with respect to difficult subject matter, or is it like Joycean difficult? I found it mostly difficult in that there would be sentences that might go on for pages, or ideas or segments or fragments of asides and detail that was really hard to sort of remember or have some sort of coherent sense of what is going on sometimes. Like, I might be in the middle of a chapter about a conversation between two people, and then there's a footnote where you read an entirely different conversation because of something that came up in that conversation, and it might explain something very technical about math or tennis, and then you don't really even know what you're reading about anymore. That's what makes it difficult. some of the endnotes were basically whole chapters, which I hated. Yeah, I thought that was a strange choice. Especially towards the end, there are 2 endnotes that are full chapters in the middle of a chapter. I like the tennis talk. What are the ideas worth exploring in this book? I think there's a lot about depression and addiction and loneliness, which are all topics I find interesting. For a book published in 1996, do you think it aged well nearly 30 years later? I think in terms of its major themes about depression and loneliness and addiction and modern entertainment culture, if anything, it is more true now than it was in the 90s. But I also don't think he would have included... I think there are some aspects of the book that an editor might have talked him out of including unless they really served the story, just because I feel like the reaction we're seeing from some people here, which I'm not saying is invalid or anything, is a distraction from what the book can do or mean to people. You know, if you find some of the, like the animal abuse section, just so distasteful that it prevents you from, I don't know, otherwise seeing anything redeemable or good about the book, does it serve the story? I personally didn't think any of that objectionable content made it impossible for me to see that, but I'm not you, so I don't know. For a person born in 1996, I did not age well. Yeah. What does it even mean to age well? And again, I guess, I'm sure I've already said this, but I don't think this is a book you even have a great sense of after a first reading. Like how I explained, for me, it was about 400 pages in that it felt like I actually had an understanding of who people were and what was happening. So if I reread those first 400 pages again, I think I would have a completely different appreciation or understanding of what they're signifying. So yeah, I think I will read this. I will reread Infinite Jest at some point, but not right now, because this month's book is... What is this month's book? I think we're jumping to nonfiction. Was it The Anxious Generation? I think. This might be another controversial book. It's a sort of anti-social media for kids book. And I was trying to think of a movie that sort of felt on theme with Infinite Jest. So if you want to, I'm going to watch The Royal Tannenbaums tonight. As a content warning, it does deal with people who have... What sort of content warning does this need? Mental health? Self-harm? You can read about it if you want. I think it is a pretty well-liked film. I think just in terms of the relationship between a family, fathers and sons, tennis, people struggling to be happy and feel connected with other people, it kind of felt appropriate. So I'm going to watch this tonight at 8 p.m. if you want to too. I like this one. It was like a lecture, matter of factual type thing, not the usual I'm used to, but liked it. Are you talking about The Anxious Generation? Or this Booktendo? How did I do? Did I make you feel bad for not liking the book? I was very deliberately not trying to just shit on people who didn't like the book. But I personally think it was a rewarding thing. I'm glad I read it. I think I will read it again. I think it's unfortunate if you didn't get anything from it. And I wonder if... I think you could if you wanted to, but that doesn't mean you have to. I still don't like it. We don't all have to be the same, like the same things and be clones of each other. Everyone's entitled to their own opinion. Yeah, and you're entitled to be wrong. So that's totally valid. All right, see you at the movies. Get your popcorn ready. You got 5 hours. Bye-bye. Bye-bye.